Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Dishing on Division III Women's Basketball. I am your host, Scott Peterson, and it will be just me today. Unfortunately, Riley is sick, so we don't have him, but we do have me, and we've got a lot of really cool topics and some pretty time-sensitive ones as we're getting close to the end of the regular season here. So we're going to get going. Our four main topics of the night, we're going to do a little bit of NPI analysis and walking through what goes into NPI and how it's calculated. We're going to talk about some tight conference races around the country. We will look at the Pool C picture. So those conference races will focus mainly on conferences that will be one-bid leagues, but that Pool C picture will be focused on at-large bids. And then we will look at the NCAA Tournament, and we have a mock bracket. First thing that we're going to hit is an NPI analysis. And to do this, we're going to walk through a calculator. So we're going to be walking through, one second here, we're going to be walking through Catholic's schedule. Catholic is a really interesting team for a couple reasons. They're a really good team. They don't have many losses on their schedule, but they also play in a very large conference and play a lot of conference games, and have some fairly weak teams in their conference. And so that will allow me to walk through a lot of different aspects of NPI. NPI stands for NCAA Power Index, and it's how teams will be selected into the NCAA tournament this year in both men's and women's basketball, and sort of how they will be seeded. It's the guide for seeding, but there are things that can override a team's NPI ranking. Each row here is a game. So we'll just start by looking first at Catholic's season opener against Shenandoah. Shenandoah's current NPI rank is 82, and Shenandoah's current NPI is 55.23. Because Catholic won the game, they get, in essence, 20 points. And this is because the winning percentage portion of NPI is weighted 20%, and the strength of schedule portion is weighted 80%. So 20% is effective. 20 points is effectively 100 points times that 20% weight. And you can see here when Catholic lost to Elizabethtown, they got 0 for this winning percentage portion of a single game NPI. Moving on to the strength of schedule portion, this is weighted 80%, and it is just 0.8 times the opponent's NPI. And this is the same regardless of if you won or lost the game. This is just giving you credit for the difficulty of opponents that you have played. And then there's the QWB, which stands for Quality Win Bonus. In women's basketball, what you do is you take the QWB threshold, which is 54, and you say, oh, let's look at the opponent's NPI. How much higher above 54 is it? In this case, it is 1.23 above 54. You multiply that 1.23 by the quality win bonus multiplier, which is 2/3, 0.66666. And that becomes a quality win bonus of 0.82. And then you just add up the winning percentage portion, the strength of schedule portion, and the quality win bonus to come up with a game NPI. And so Catholic, when they beat Shenandoah, they get a game NPI of 65. These opponent NPIs are always changing. So it's different on day one of the season and the last day of the season. They reflect the opponent's current NPI. So let's just say, all right, that first game against Shenandoah, it now counts. So we've got our running NPI over here, which is going to be 65. That's from that game. Catholic's next game, they played Wesleyan of Connecticut. You can see Wesleyan is a lower ranked team in NPI than Shenandoah. So they have a lower opponent NPI. Catholic still gets 20 points for beating them. It's always the same for a win. It's that 100 points times the 20% winning percentage weight. The strength of schedule portion that they get for beating Wesleyan is going to be less than the strength of schedule portion they get for beating Shenandoah. And then for quality win bonus, because Wesleyan is not above 54.00 in their NPI, Catholic does not get a quality win bonus, and you cannot get a negative quality win bonus. It's either positive or 0. So in this case, Catholic's game NPI for beating Wesleyan is 60.31. So we're going to count this one too. So right now, this running NPI is just the average of those two results. They beat Rochester Tech, who's a little bit stronger than Wesleyan. So the running NPI went up a little bit from 62.65. Actually, no, it went down just a little bit because of how much better Shenandoah was than Wesleyan. Then we come to Elizabethtown. Catholic lost this game, so they get a 0 for the winning percentage portion of this game NPI. Strength of schedule, though, Elizabethtown's a really strong team, so they get a strong strength of schedule portion, higher than Shenandoah, because again, that's completely separate from whether or not you won or lost the game. And then they're not eligible for a quality win bonus, even though Elizabethtown is above 54, because they did not beat Elizabethtown. You don't get a quality win bonus if you didn't win the game. And this loss has to count as well. So we keep doing this. And we are, every single game, Catholic's running MPI is going to change. They beat Wilkes, so you can see their MPI went down from 58.66 to 56.07. That's because Wilkes is near the bottom of the division, and their game NPI for beating Wilkes was 45. So it was actually they got less credit for beating Wilkes than they did for losing to Elizabethtown. And that will be the case in a few spots. So we keep going down here. Catholic went on a really nice winning streak. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So it's they beat Juniata. That's their 13th win. Then they lost to Scranton, beat Goucher, and beat Wilkes. So now they're at 15 wins, and we can talk about the minimum wins threshold. So up to this point, all of Catholic's first 15 wins had to be included in their NPI because they hadn't hit that minimum wins threshold of 15. So even this Wilkes win valued at 45, or this Lycoming win valued at 52, that really brought down Catholic's running NPI, they had to be counted. They weren't to 15 wins yet. Well, what MPI does internally now is once Catholic beat Susquehanna on January 29th, that was their 16th win. And MPI says, hey, once you have your 16th win, if your lowest valued win would bring down your overall MPI, you don't have to count it anymore. So we're going to sort games up to this point by game NPI, and I realize I need my ribbon back. And so NPI goes into its formula and it says, hey, this Wilkes game, one of the two, we don't have to count it anymore. So once they beat Susquehanna, not only did they get to count the Susquehanna win game NPI, they get to drop Wilkes. And so that moved their running NPI up. Well, then we move on to Moravian. They beat Moravian. What does that mean? It means they got 17 wins now. They don't have to count their lowest two if those two wins would bring down their NPI. And this other Wilkes win would bring down their NPI. As you can see, it's 45, far below 58. So we can flip that to false because we're not going to count. Catholic doesn't have to count that Wilkes win anymore. So that will move their running NPI up a little more. Then we get to Elizabethtown, the rematch that they won that game. That is a big game NPI, 70.72, brings it up. But again, we can do this little trick. We have to skip the losses. These losses bring down Catholic's NPI, and because of that, you have to keep the losses. So we'll go to the next win that brings down their NPI. Lycoming, 52. Yep, that's less than 59. That NPI formula will drop that game. So now you can see Catholic has really started to raise their NPI because they no longer have to count the Wilkes wins and the Lycoming win. Then they lost to Scranton. That's a loss. You're going to have to count it. if we come here and let's say, let me just sort these real quick. Let's just say they go through and they close out the regular season. So now we only need to find, I got my handy formulas already here. Don't know why that says 37. Win rank. Well, looks like we're going to have to skip this as I broke something. So Catholic only needs to find their top 15 wins, which is going to go down through Juniata. And then those two Moravian wins and the Maryville win and the Lycoming win that hasn't happened, they don't have to count any of those. And now their running MPI is all the way up to 60.21. So that minimum wins threshold is not some minimum wins that you have to get to be eligible for postseason or something like that. It's just that until you get to 15 wins, you have to count all of them. And then once you get to over 15 wins, if a win would hurt your NPI, you don't have to keep it. And that's pretty valuable for a team like Catholic, as again, Wilkes is near the bottom of the division. And pretty much every team in the top 50 or 75 is going to beat Wilkes every time that they play them. But Catholic, because they're in the landmark, and so is Wilkes, Catholic has to play them twice. They can't avoid that. And, you know, a team from the UAA doesn't have to play Wilkes twice. And so NPI was kind of built to acknowledge that sort of setup. And teams don't have to keep wins that low. That minimum wins threshold can be set to different amounts. You could set it to 10. You could set it to 20. And those are decisions the Women's Basketball Committee will be able to make in the future if they so desire. I think 15 seems like a really solid number to set it at. You get a really solid ranking of teams. So that is Catholic. But now what we're going to do... we're going to look at Maryville. Kind of a different... Maryville's been on a really nice stretch recently, but they started the year with 8 straight losses against Division III opponents. So let's walk through this with Maryville. That's wrong. Hang on a sec. That should be better. All right. So Maryville opened with center. They lost that game. No winning percentage portion, no quality win bonus, just the SOS portion. We're going to count that game. Remember, Catholic counted every single loss, but we have an interesting setup here with Maryville. So the Barry win, the Barry loss, game MPI of 42.06, lower than the running MPI, so we count it. 30 Sewanee 37.94, lower than the running MPI. We still count it. Oglethorpe 40.11, still lower than the running MPI. We count it. Actually, no, sorry. Let me roll back. When they lost their second game versus Barry, you could average their 2 game MPIs to come up with a running MPI, but once they lost this game to Barry, the NPI formula will now look at the game against center and say, hey, if we count this game, their overall MPI actually rises from 42.06. So we don't count it. Similar thing happens against Sewanee. Sewanee would be their worst loss to date, or their lowest valued loss to date. So it starts to count, but the Barry loss now flips to not counting, because if you don't have a win, we only count your worst loss. So all of these losses now hey, look, they played Catholic. I didn't realize that when I set this up. But all of these losses now don't count. They are just counting their lowest one. So this is the scenario where dropping losses happens, and it's not a particularly nice thing. The only time that you are dropping a loss is when including it would help your NPI. It's not really a free opponent. So now we get to Wesleyan. Maryville got their first win. Wesleyan is not a great team, but because they get this 20 points for winning the game, this ends up being a decent game NPI. So once this starts to count, the formula now goes back and it says, will any of these losses now actually bring down their team, Maryville's overall MPI now that they have this win on board? And so we can see like there are probably a lot of these. So Ferrum would bring it down. Mary Washington would bring it down. Oglethorpe would bring it down. So now they have to count a few more of those losses because now they wouldn't be helping their MPI by including them. It would be hurting their MPI. Marching on, Maryville beats Warren Wilson. So now their running MPI jumps up, and we got to do this dance again. Are there any of the losses that we weren't counting that we got to count now because it would bring down their MPI? And I'm just doing this by eyeballing it, so I might get a specific game wrong, but so now this is what Maryville's kind of counting games looks like. And this is where if you see effective wins or adjusted wins or qualifying wins, this is what the math behind the scenes is doing, or the logic. This Catholic loss is not going to count because that would bring up their NPI. And if a loss would bring up your NPI, it doesn't get counted. This loss would bring it down. We're going to count it. This loss would bring it down. We're going to count it. We're going to count this win. We're not to 15 wins yet, so there's no scenario where a win wouldn't count for a team like Maryville. And we just kind of keep marching forward. Now they kind of get a big win over Bellhaven. They're on a roll now. These are all counting. Whoops. They lost to Piedmont. They beat Huntington, and they beat LaGrange. So they are not at 15 wins, so they don't get to check and see if they can drop any wins. And their running MPI is still below this Catholic loss, and so that Catholic loss does not count against their MPI. So those are kind of two scenarios that show why a team might be dropping wins late in the season, and also show why a team might be not counting every one of their losses. You could say, hey, does this mean Maryville can just schedule really good teams like Catholic, Scranton, and Elizabethtown, knowing that if they lose to them, it's not going to count against their MPI? Kind of. That's a true statement. But the only reason it's not going to count against their MPI is because they have a bad NPI. So if you're a team who's trying to make the NCAA tournament, doing something knowing that the game NPI in a loss wouldn't count is not sound logic, because it wouldn't be, it would be hurting you or not affecting you. And if a loss is not going to count, you probably don't have an MPI that's in the range of getting a Pool C bid. So that is our little MPI calculator. We're going to flip back to our slides and continue on. So, and I welcome any questions on this. Like, there's a lot of moving pieces in NPI, quality win bonus, minimum wins threshold, dropping wins, dropping losses. But I hope that those kind of two opposite types of scenarios gave you a feel for when teams are dropping wins and dropping losses and why they would be doing so, why the MPI formula has that as a feature of it. One thing I think is really cool about the NCAA Power Index is it has a way for valuing very different types of schedules. We have Tufts and Trinity out of the NESCAC, who plays a single round robin conference schedule. We have Wash U out of the University Athletic Association, who doesn't have a conference tournament, so only plays 25 total games. These teams, and they're both really strong leagues, these teams have lower winning percentages. I believe all of them, I know Tufts and WashU are under 700. Trinity might be just a little above 700, but they have really strong strength of schedules and they have won a lot of games against good teams. And NPI, there's a path under NPI to lose 8, 9, 10, 11, maybe even 12 games if you have enough really strong wins to offset it. And you can, if you're in these types of leagues, there's a path for you to not have to, go 23-2, and you can make the NCAA tournament. Similarly, not all these are the same, but Randolph-Macon, UMass Dartmouth, Western New England, Christopher Newport, those teams have played much weaker schedules relative to Tufts, Trinity, and Washington University. But there's a path for these types of schedules as well. All of these teams, I believe, have won over 90% of their games, and that's going to be required. You're going to have to win a much larger percentage of your games. Just because you're playing weaker teams, there's a way for NPI to still judge, hey, if you go 22-3 against this schedule, even though it's weaker, that's a very impressive thing that a lot of teams aren't able to do. And you can craft a Pool C worthy NPI ranking against that type of schedule. And I think that that's great. Our old system was kind of, our committee members weren't given really good tools with which to differentiate teams. And so if a team had a winning percentage under 650, or if they had a strength of schedule under 500, it was really hard to know, how do I compare these two types of resumes? And so largely we didn't. But MPI is just a dumb computer that we give a formula to. And it has the ability to say, hey, did you beat good teams? Or did you beat mediocre teams, but an overwhelming number of them? And kind of compare that to how the rest of the country did. And I think that that's a great feature of MPI. Moving on to some conference races. These are all of the conferences that have 3 or more teams above, I believe, 10% chance to win their conference tournament. So the first one is the NJAC, where Rowan, Montclair State, and William Patterson are all really, they have really similar chances in my simulations to win the NJAC conference tournament, with New Jersey City and Stockton with chances there. And just like any simulation, it's looking at history and team's efficiency margin to try to guess the future, not really guess the future, but say like what would happen most commonly. So while most commonly Rowan wins the A, followed by Montclair State and William Patterson, it doesn't mean that it's impossible for any of the other teams to go and win that conference tournament. It just means that it's unlikely when looking at past results this season. But the NJAC is one where I think anything can happen. And since none of those teams really have a chance for an at-large bid, there's a lot riding on that conference tournament. So we still have a couple more weeks of the conference schedule as those teams jockey for seeding, and then the conference tournament. Next conference is the ASC, where a recent loss by Hardin-Simmons to East Texas Baptist has really, really reduced their chances of getting an at-large bid. There's still a chance for them, and there's still a chance for Mary Hardin-Baylor, but they're fairly small. East Texas Baptist would have to almost lose out to miss out on an at-large bid, I believe. But as you can see on that A percentage, it's almost an equal amount of the time that East Texas Baptist and Hardin-Simmons win the ASC conference tournament. Again, in my simulations, not a prediction, but with Mary Hardin-Baylor close. So that's going to be a really fascinating tournament to watch and see what's on the line there. In the CCS, there's been a lot of movement as well, as we've got Belhaven, Asbury, and Piedmont, the 3 up top, with LaGrange and Maryville right there. A little bit of chance for Huntington. Looks like 5 out of the 1,000 simulations, they won the CCS. This is another big one. And yeah, I don't have any other things to say on the CCS. Just should be another close conference race. Now we get to, I don't know what C&E stands for. Conference of New England. where Roger Williams still is above Western New England in my simulations, which I find really interesting. They're close in efficiency margin, but Western New England is far ahead in the conference standings. And it could be that home court advantage just doesn't end up meaning tons with how closely matched those teams seem to be. And actually, Endicott is right there as well. I believe all three of those teams are in action right now, and we're all leading last time I checked. But of these three, Western New England basically has a Pool C bid locked up. I'm not sure if they could lose out and miss, but they are sitting really well. So less is riding on the conference tournament for Western New England, but Roger Williams and Endicott almost never get a Pool C bid. So they need to go and win the CNE. The Empire 8 is another fascinating one. Brockport State took a really narrow loss to St. John Fisher. That was a great game. Knocked Brockport State's at-large bid percentage, that ALWYNI, which stands for at-large when you need it, from about 15% to 5%. And so the Empire 8 really looks like it's trending to be a one-bid league with Geneseo State, St. John Fisher, Brockport, the front runners, but Nazareth and Houghton have been good as well. In the Liberty League, Vassar is the favorite to come out of the Liberty League conference tournament, but Ithaca, Rochester Tech, and Union are all right there as well. This conference also looks like it'll be a one-bid league. The MASCAC, Bridgewater State is still hanging on to some at-large bid chances. And they're also the overwhelming favorite to come out of the MASCAC. But Framingham State, Westfield State, and Salem State are all have decent percentages in my simulations that they come away winning that conference tournament, above 10% for all of them. In the OAC, this is a fascinating one where Baldwin Wallace is the front runner. Ohio Northern and Capital are close behind with John Carroll with a good chance as well. About 10% of the time they were winning the OAC conference tournament. And all four of those teams have decent at-large chances. Baldwin Wallace pretty much has a Pool C bid locked up. Capital is sitting really well right now, and Ohio Northern and John Carroll have work to do. But because all four of those teams are strong and they have a strong middle of the conference as well with Marietta, Otterbein, and Mount Union, it provides a lot of opportunity with each game for these teams to get a big win and really improve their NPI and improve their standing. But also on the flip side, because they're all strong teams, those are hard games to win. And so with each win, you're going to see these teams move around quite a bit, as Capital did recently with a big win, I think about a week ago. In the SAA, Millsaps is your front runner with Berry and Center close behind. We'll talk about Millsaps and Berry and also Belhaven a little bit later, but those are teams who potentially could host in the NCAA tournament because of geographical needs. So the specific team that comes out of these conferences might have a little extra benefit of playing at home. I think that's a benefit. If I was an athlete, maybe I would want the road trip, but that is another potential reward for these teams. And then in the SCAC, we've got Colorado College and McMurray, really, really close in my simulations for winning the conference tournament. Texas Lutheran with a significant chance as well, and Trinity, Texas, winning that conference tournament 70 out of 1,000 simulations. And then when it comes to at-large bids, Colorado College really has one almost locked up. McMurray is sitting really, really well. Texas Lutheran would probably need to have a couple big wins. They would probably need to win out until losing in the conference title game. And even then, I'm not sure if their chances would be over 50%. So that's the SCAC, and that's the last tournament where the last conference that had at least three teams above 10% chance to, or 10% rate of winning their conference tournament in my simulations. So those were some conference tournaments, largely in one bid leagues, but let's go look at the Pool C picture. So these are our locks and virtual locks. I chose the same cutoff as the D3 Datacast folks of 97.5% at large when you need it. There's a whole lot of teams in this. And it's helpful to point out this does not mean that these teams are locks and can lose their remaining games and be guaranteed a pool C. I think some of them are in that boat, but I don't know if which ones specifically, and definitely not all of them. It's just that in my simulations, an overwhelming percentage of the time, they ended up with an MPI that made the NCAA tournament. So if you are fans of these teams, they are sitting well, and they just need to keep on doing what they have been doing this year. Maybe I shouldn't rush through it too fast since there is 20 odd teams on this list. Carnegie Mellon sitting quite well out of the UAA. Ohio Wesleyan has had a really, really good year. Gettysburg still, well, I guess they're 100% just as Johns Hopkins is 100% even after losing to Johns Hopkins. So those teams are sitting well. So then we get to teams that are in good shape. Whitewater, Wisconsin Whitewater just missed that 97.5% cutoff. They're a team who has more losses than some of the teams around them, but they have just played such a strong schedule, and they have a lot of really strong wins that keeps their MPI high. McMurray, Hope, Trinity of Connecticut, Bates, Capital, and Carroll. Bates is on a great run. Carroll's been on a solid run as well. These teams definitely still have work to do this year to remain in Pool C shape, but as it currently stands in the simulations, they do well. Here's your bubble in group. Not a very large group. Cortland, Bridgewater, Virginia, WashU, Tufts, Stevens Point, and Merchant Marine. These teams are definitely not guaranteed a Pool C bid. They will need a couple key wins down the stretch. I believe WashU is at 7 losses. If they finish the year 4-1, 8 losses, I think they will be in. But if they go 3-2, so 9 losses total, I think they would be out. Kind of similar to last year, where I think WashU Chicago on the last day of the year, maybe even the last game happening, was a play-in game for the NCAA tournament. I don't think that'll be quite the case this year, but it could very well come down to WashU's last game. And because of the lack of a conference tournament for the UAA, we're able to say such clear things about a team like WashU, whereas a team like Tufts has the NESCAC tournament awaiting them, and a loss in the quarters versus a win, loss in the semis versus a win, loss in the finals versus a win. All of those come with different scenarios for their NCAA tournament hopes. And Washington Jefferson also here at 39.1, and Southern Virginia sitting pretty well, fairly well. I hesitate to say pretty well, as they are the last team in this bubble in category. Bubble out, so teams just missing. If you remember, I think Southern Virginia was 36.1, so a little bit of a gap down to Amherst. I guess I shouldn't say Amherst, it's Amherst. Rhode Island College, Chicago, Mary Hardin, Baylor, Texas Lutheran, and Carthage. All of these teams, John Carroll, Shenandoah, Ohio Northern, is there another one? UW La Crosse. All these teams are bubble out, but have opportunities in front of them to improve. Most of these teams are playing conferences with other strong teams, and so they might have games remaining on their schedule that they are underdogs in, but if they win, it really improves their chances of making the NCAA tournament. Carthage was close to 0% at large when they needed it percentage, and then they went out and beat Illinois Wesleyan and moved them all the way up to getting in 13% of the time. And then we're down to our slim chance teams. I think just one column of them. These teams, there are scenarios where they do not win their conference tournament or don't play in one in the case of Emory, and still get a Pool C bid. For most of these teams, I imagine it would be winning out until losing in their conference championship game. which is going to be a tall task for, it's a tall task, which is why their percentage chances are low, but it's not zero. And it is a 0% chance for a lot of teams. So that's your Pool C picture, kind of just looking at where teams stand as of today, and a single big result changes that. So now we've got our massive leverage games. There are 22 remaining regular season games where both teams are above 10% at large when they need it, percentage chance. One of them tips in 25 minutes here. Smith and Tufts. That's a really, really big game. It's not a must-win for anyone. It's not a must-win for Tufts because I think in most simulations they lose the game. But if Tufts were to pull off this upset, it would significantly move them up from that 45.9%. Smith doesn't need this win to make the tournament, but it is important as Smith is wanting to be seeded as well as possible, and they're probably on the 2 line as opposed to the 1 line, and they need to keep their standing. They need to win that game. And then we got some upcoming games on tomorrow night if they don't get postponed. Oshkosh and Stevens Point in the WIAC, La Crosse and Whitewater, Baldwin Wallace and John Carroll is a big one. And then Bridgewater and Southern Virginia is a really interesting non-conference game this late in the year. You don't see too many of those. And then moving on, Carnegie Mellon and Chicago is a big one. Hope versus Trine is a big one. There probably are scenarios where one of Hope and Trine doesn't make the tournament at all. They would probably need to lose that game and either lose another regular season game or lose in the quarters of the MIAA tournament. It would take something a little bit unexpected. I think if Hope and Trine split between this game and then both make the MIAA title game, between those two, if they split, I think they both are fine. Trine is in a better position at this point, 1 game better than Hope. Tons and tons of games in the WIAC are going to be really impactful. Bowdoin versus Trinity, ETBU versus Mary Hardin Baylor. That's probably a must-win for Mary Hardin Baylor. Capital and John Carroll, probably a must-win for John Carroll. And then moving on to the rest of the year, probably must-win for Shenandoah there. Both their game against Washington Lee and their game against Randolph-Macon. So you can see why Shenandoah, if you looked at their MPI, they're probably in the 60s, 70s, 80s. But the reason that they have an above 10% chance is because they do get to play Washington and Lee and Randolph-Macon, which gives them a great chance to move up. Yeah, Chicago watched you in the last day of the year. Chicago could play their way into the NCAA tournament by almost running the tables. And so, and WashU might need that game as well. That could totally be a play-in game for the 2nd straight year. So now we're going to go look at the NCAA tournament and look at a mock bracket. Mock bracket. This is from Matt Snyder. He has made so many brackets and has a really good handle on geography and where teams will need to be slotted. But this is still a completely unofficial bracket. I'm going to try to talk through things that are closer to set in stone and things that are much less set in stone. But keep in mind that all of this is unofficial. So currently in my simulations, your 1 seeds end up being NYU, Bowdoin, Scranton, and Oshkosh. My simulations expect NYU, Bowdoin, and Scranton to go undefeated more often than they don't. And it does have 1 additional loss in the cards for Oshkosh. But if, especially Bowdoin and Scranton, if they lose a game or if Oshkosh loses 2, they could definitely fall off of that 1 line. But that's currently how it's set up. And these are just ordered into quadrants, overall seeds 1, 2, 3, and 4 across the top. The committee would then most likely match up the overall 1 seed and the overall 4 seed on the same side of the bracket. So it would, likely match up NYU and Oshkosh to meet in the Final Four should those teams get that far. Let's look at the number 2 seeds first. So your 2 lines has Whitman, Gustavus, Adolphus, Smith, and Illinois Wesleyan. Let's first look at Oshkosh, Gustavus, Adolphus, and Illinois Wesleyan. Those are all teams in a similar geographic area, and it looks like, which we kind of call the Midwest or Upper Midwest, it looks like there's going to need to be about 5 4-team pods for those teams. And if you have 5, it makes sense to put 4 of them in the same quadrant because that would minimize potential flights for your Sweet 16 sectional round. But that means that the 5th one, you kind of have to put it elsewhere. Well, you do. And so you get to put it where it makes the most sense seed-wise. And Gustavus Adolphus would be nearer the bottom of the 2 seeds, so closer to 8th overall than 5th overall. And so they get matched up with Bowdoin because the seeding works and Smith can bus to either Bowdoin or Scranton. And so if there's not a geographical constraint there, it makes sense to just seed them. The term that Bethany Danley kept using was bracket integrity. And so it really seems that they want to maintain bracket integrity wherever they can, unless something forces their hand, like geography. Whitman is right around overall seed number 8, so they are still on the 2 line. But if they do end up in that 8th spot, they just get matched up with NYU, as they would need to fly to, if they make the Sweet 16, they would have to fly to NYU, Bowdoin, or Scranton. So it doesn't really matter where we put the Whitman pod. And so we're going to maintain bracket integrity where we can, and they get matched up in the NYU quadrant. Let's look at 16 seeds. Most of these all make a lot of sense. The 8 seeds would be fun, sending Trinity to NYU, Cortland to Bowdoin, Washington and Lee to Scranton, and then Hope to Oshkosh. And then there would be your 9 seeds: Bridgewater, Merchant Marine, Bates, and Wash U. Moving down to the 2 line, your 15 seeds. Kind of kept this hidden, but in this specific, again, unofficial mock bracket, Whitman is hosting, which I think would be welcome news to Whitman. But a handful of teams will need to fly, among them Cal Lutheran, or whoever comes out of the SCIAC. It actually could be Whittier. But they have to fly anyway, and so flying them into Whitman makes sense if the other seeds make sense. Colorado College would be roughly a 7 quadrant seed, and so they have to fly as well. They would have to fly wherever, so they get moved in to there. And then Tufts would be like, Tufts doesn't have to fly, but in this scenario, Whitman, who would otherwise have to fly, doesn't, and so it's a wash flights wise. And then you can get a team to Whitman that makes the perfect sense seed wise, and in this case, it would be Tufts. Moving over in the bracket, Gustavus Adolphus faces off against Stevens Point, and then Wartburg and Ripon are the other seeds opposite them. The Upper Midwest has a lot of kind of pod 1 seeds and pod 3 seeds. So Stevens Point is very overseeded to play a 2. They're probably not a 15. They're probably more like a 13 or a 12, but there just aren't going to be other options. And I think similar, if you zoom to the right and look at Webster playing Illinois Wesleyan, Webster and Stevens Point would be really, really strong for 15 seeds. But we just don't have weaker teams that make geographical sense. The weakest team is going to be whoever comes out of the UMAC, and you see Northwestern is up there against Oshkosh, as they are the highest seed in this geography. So we're going to maintain bracket integrity for the 1 seed first, and then do the best we can for the 2 seeds. And it just happens that there's a lot of strong teams in the Midwest. Smith gets to play St. Joseph's of Maine. Elizabethtown and Rhode Island College are 2 other teams in that pod. I believe Matt made sure to not have any conference rematches in the first round, but I don't believe he was trying to stay away from conference rematches in the second round or non-conference rematches in the first round. Both of those are allowed, but I think the committee does try to avoid them where they can, because that enhances bracket integrity. But this is just a quicker mock bracket. And then in that bottom right quadrant, Illinois Wesleyan and Webster, and Whitewater and Capital. That's a fun pod as well. Illinois Wesleyan being a little more centrally located means we can get both Whitewater there and Capital and mix up regions a little bit more. Moving on, we'll look at the 3 seeds. Gettysburg, Macon, Dartmouth, and Baldwin-Wallace are kind of your rough on the 3 seed line now. I guess let's go by overall seed. Your 4 seed, the line, ETBU, Hopkins, Ohio Wesleyan, and Stout. I wasn't sure if Oshkosh, Stout, and Gustavus Adolphus could all host opening weekend pods, but in this specific mock bracket, they are able to. 5 seeds, McMurray, Christopher Newport, Trine, and Bethel. 6 seeds, Western New England, Carnegie Mellon, Messiah, and Catholic. So then let's just look at the matchups with our top remaining seeds. So the 14 seeds that go with our 3, Gettysburg and Geneseo, Macon and TCNJ, Dartmouth and Lebanon Valley, and Baldwin-Wallace and Chatham. I don't know if Baldwin-Wallace has played Chatham this year. Hopefully not. Bridgewater, Southern Virginia. That's a bad OCR. Maine, Maritime, Washington, and Jefferson. And then we'll just reveal all this. We've got our Texas pod. Well, this is kind of our Texas pod. We'll talk about that last. We'll talk about it next. So in this pod, I believe everybody can get to East Texas Baptist. So McMurray, Millsaps, and Belhaven can all bus there. But if not, that could mean that a team like Millsaps or Belhaven is needed to be the host for geography. Whoever the most centrally located team is would be the host for a pod like that. But looking at this overall landscape, there are lots and lots of pieces that can be moved. The 3 flights that you need are Colorado College, Whitman, and Cal Lutheran, or whoever comes out of the SCIAC. And so you could actually just take those 3 teams and fly them all separately into pods elsewhere. I imagine if the committee does choose to do that, they'd want to figure out how do we create the most fairly seeded pod for a top 8 seed like Whitman. Whitman in this scenario would probably still be placed here. There would just be a pod built around them with 3 teams who can all bust to each other, but would be appropriately seeded to be in there with a top 8 seed like Whitman. Not a ton would change if Illinois Wesleyan ends up as a top 4 seed, and they're the 1 and Oshkosh is the 2. In that scenario, if Oshkosh is the 2, they could potentially be moved out. But the reason that it made so much sense to move Gustavus out is because for bracket integrity, they match up way better with Bowdoin. Oshkosh and Illinois Wesleyan, regardless of which one is 4, the other one is fairly likely to be 5 at this point in time. And it just makes sense to, seeding wise, to keep them in the same quadrant. What else to say about this? Let's look at potential sectional round. So again, as Bethany talked about, they play through scenarios of not just if Chalk wins to get to the sectional round, but what if some of the other seeds win as well? So but starting with chalk, NYU, East Texas Baptist, Gettysburg, and Whitman. Whitman and ETBU would have to fly regardless of what other things happen, I believe. And so at that point, it doesn't matter if Gettysburg is within busing distance of NYU. I believe it is. But if it wasn't, it would be 3 flights regardless of if it was hosted at NYU or Gettysburg. And so you would just pick the top host, again, provided they meet all of the hosting requirements and provided their men's team is not also in line to host that sectional weekend, which could be the case for NYU. Is there a nightmare scenario here? I wonder if there's a scenario if a team like Tufts comes out of here, where more teams can get to Gettysburg via bus than can get to NYU. And we end up in a Transylvania situation like we did last year. It would definitely take a scenario like it took last year, where the 3rd highest seeded team in a pod had to win it for that geographical constraint to be invoked. Moving over here, Bowdoin, Hopkins, Macon, and Gustavus Adolphus. Gustavus would have to fly wherever, and so would anyone who comes out of that pod. Theoretically, with Macon, Newport, there could be a scenario where Bowdoin is not the geographical optimal spot. Have to see. Scranton, Ohio Wesleyan, Dartmouth, Smith. I think everyone is in close enough range that Scranton is fairly well lined up to be the host there. And then in the Midwest, it would take like Oshkosh is not set up very well to be actually no, Oshkosh is not set up well to host sectionals. Illinois Wesleyan, again, if their men's team is not hosting sectionals, is really going to be set up pretty well, because if we get a pod like this that has Catholic, W&J, Baldwin Wallace, and Chatham, or even this one, Tryon, Transylvania, Ohio Wesleyan, and Immaculata, the chances that a team comes out of a pod like this that can't bus to Oshkosh but can bus to Illinois Wesleyan is pretty high. And so, yeah, those are so the main things to look at are men's teams like NYU, Macon, and Illinois Wesleyan how likely is it that the men's team makes it to the Sweet 16 and is in line to host there. And then, yeah, and just after that, it's eyeballing if there are interesting geographical scenarios if non-chalk wins. I'm not sure that there is. And it probably, if they want to preserve bracket integrity and, well, I might be overusing that term. I don't want to use it in a way that is not intended. But if it is desired to give your overall number 1 seed the best possible chance to host sectionals, it does make sense to have the pods in there with the teams that would have to fly regardless. So like having the Whitman pod in there, or the 5th Midwest pod, or the Texas/South pod. I would not be surprised if one or more of those are in NOU's quadrant. So that is the mock bracket. Kind of gives people a sense for where teams might be seated based on past results and the simulated future, not the predicted future, the simulated future. But would always welcome questions on, is this team overseeded? Is this team likely to be underseeded? Is there a chance that this team could host? Like, is there a chance Christopher Newport could host? They're right there. And so I'm not sure what sort of dominoes need to fall if one of Gettysburg or Hopkins doesn't need to host, or if Macon needs to lose a couple games. But Christopher Newport is probably the closest team to hosting. Theoretically, if Trine goes and runs the table, they would have a very strong chance of hosting. And in most years, they're set up kind of well where they are in Indiana, because teams from Ohio can get there as well as everyone from the Chicagoland and potentially Wisconsin area. But in my Sims, we have a lower number of Ohio teams than we usually do. We do have Baldwin Wallace, Ohio Wesleyan, and Capital. But John Carroll and Ohio Northern miss more often than they make it. And so we're just a little bit lighter for trying to be a team like trying to be needed geographically to host. I believe WashU is in this, but Chicago's not. So that's another one that can get to Trine that's often in the tournament. Probably not a path to Bethel to host. Probably not a path for Catholic to host unless they win the landmark tournament. Probably no path for McMurray to host, as it's pretty unlikely that they ever end up above East Texas Baptist. Are there things that would tip the scales for or against Whitman? I mean, Whitman needs to win out to really preserve their chances of hosting, but I'm not sure what else would really help it. Actually, if Colorado College lost a few games and somehow missed the tournament, that could complicate things for Whitman. I think Whitman hosting is a pretty narrow line. Matt was able to make it work here, and I think if the committee can make it work, they would want to for a top 8 seed. While being a top 8 seed does not guarantee you hosting, you can tell the desire is for the top 16 seeds to host. So that's kind of the starting spot, and then they stop hosting if they don't meet hosting requirements or if there are geographical constraints. So that is hosting in the NCAA tournament. We are in the home stretch here. So some fulcrums, I think I hit some of those. Does Whitman go undefeated and stay in the top 8? Who comes out of the SAA? Because Millsaps can get to East Texas Baptist by bus, but Barry cannot. So if Barry comes out of there and Belhaven comes out of the CCS, that host could flip to Belhaven, or potentially there's a lot of rebracketing and something gets hosted at Washington and Lee. Not sure about that. And in that scenario, you're probably flying teams into Texas, and you do not have a Whitman Washington pod. So where do SCIAC and Colorado College get flown? Do they get flown into Whitman, or do they get flown somewhere else? Again, it looks like 5 Midwest pods. My assumption is that 4 of them get put in the same quadrant and 1 of them gets moved out. That does not have to be the case. If more flights are allowable, there might be more mixing of regions, and that would be awesome. But I'm not on the committee. I don't have inside information. I don't know what the general parameters are on number of flights. Other fulcrums, who gets lined up to host sectionals. As soon as we see the bracket, we can look and see, if the top 4 seeds all win their pods in this quadrant, the sectionals aren't going to be at the number 1 seed, or not. Let's see here. We're light in Ohio. We talked about that. So even if Baldwin Wallace, Ohio, Wesleyan, Capital, usually, Ohio is a big state and a strong basketball state. And it's a really nice spot to have strong teams from. I guess I keep forgetting they have Carnegie Mellon. Sorry, I forgot about Carnegie Mellon. So 4 teams is still strong. But they are like wild cards, meaning they can go east or they can go west. And they just enable a lot of flexibility in the bracket. So I think the committees love having lots of Ohio teams in there. Let's see here. Couple questions. We'll show this one from Pete. Are the mock brackets based on projections or what the bracket would be if the season ended today? They're based on projections. So they include all results up through Sunday, because I didn't think there were many Monday games that were very impactful. So they include all the real results through Sunday, but then did simulate the rest of the season because conference tournaments have a large impact on whether teams are dropping some bad wins or not. And it's kind of really necessary to see where teams are going to be. So that's a good question, but it is based on projections. Then we had a question here from Ron. Is the NPI non-dynamic, or is it or static in that sense, or is it dynamic? It is dynamic. So the numbers that I was showing you for like that Catholic win over Maryville or the Maryville loss to Catholic, looking at it from the opposite point of view, those opponent MPIs and resulting potential quality win bonuses are going to change with every single result, because the NPI, I didn't want to use this word because it is intimidating, but it's recursive. So what you do is you calculate everyone's game NPI and you do the whole dropping wins and losses logic, and you get everyone's final season NPI. And then you take their final season NPI and you redo the whole process with now everyone's final season NPI from the first run becomes everyone else's opponent NPIs for run 2. You do that again. And if you do this enough times, the numbers stop changing. And it takes about, I'm doing 80 iterations of that in code. But around 30 to 40 is when the numbers stop moving. And since Matt Snyder's numbers since mine match Matt's, and since ours match the NCAA's, like down to the third decimal, we're both like, we must all be running enough iterations that the numbers stop moving. But no, so it is always changing, which, I mean, we all know, you look at teams. There are some teams that were way stronger at the beginning of the season than they are now. And then there's the opposite. But I think short of finding a way to lock in something, you would have to like model team trends or something. It's just way simpler and way more fair to have it either be completely static or completely dynamic. And I think dynamic makes the most sense, where you can value a team's results based off of both their entire season's work, but everyone else's entire season's work. Those are great questions. So, well, I kind of did this out of order. Overtime. We have a fifth topic, overtime questions. We got those 2 questions. Let me do a quick check to see if anything has popped up on Twitter. Looks like nothing. Nothing in my DMs. So those are the questions. And then our last thing, because I think Smith and Tufts tipped off 2 minutes ago that we should be following, future plan for live streams that Riley and I are going to put on. So we're going to be doing a little bit of extra lifting. On Saturday, March 1st, we will have a late evening live stream, as 36 of the 42 Pool A's will be decided on Saturday, March 1st. One of them will be decided earlier, but we'll know 37 of them. So we're going to be doing a late night live stream talking through bid thieves, and how other teams' Pool C fortunes have shifted based on if they have won in their conference's quarterfinals, semifinals, or lost. Next day, Sunday, March 2nd, we'll be going live as soon as impactful results are decided. So there are 5 remaining Pool A's decided on that Sunday. I believe UAA games are done on the 1st. Not quite sure. But anyway, on that Sunday, I'll be running women's NPI often, maybe after each result of the day. And we will be going live as soon as we're confident that the results are decided. So maybe the last game that's still in progress is, there's a wide margin with 5 minutes to go, and we can get on the air. Or maybe whoever wins that last game would just decide a Pool A, but won't have really much impact on the rest of the country. So we'll be going live very soon on that day. And then on Monday, March 3rd, we'll be doing a bracket reaction show. So I believe the show is scheduled for 2:30 to 3 p.m. Eastern. So we might be going on the air close to when it's over, like 3:30, but it might be later. I want some time to punch in the bracket, and we can see where the strengths or weaknesses, not weaknesses, which pods might be the toughest, which quadrants might be the toughest. Because even if We know every team's seed via NPI. We can seed everyone 1 to 64. That doesn't mean that the gap between 1 and 2 and the gap between 31 and 32 are equal. And so it could just be that, the way geography falls out and the way specific seeds fall out, there will be some pods that have stronger overall teams in them than other pods. And that's just to be expected. But we'll be having a show those 3 days. And then I think we'll be joined by a special guest for most of those shows. So former coach, former RAC member, talk about some teams there. And we might have a second special guest, but that's TBD. That's all Riley. He's got all the connections. I have none of them. But we're excited to talk about those results as they happen, how they affect the MPI landscape, and how they affect the NCAA field. Because, sometime on Sunday, we'll be able to tell you who the 64 teams in the field are, barring some mishap or a data error, which has not happened before and shouldn't happen in the future. The women's side is is a lot more simple than the men's side, as the men's have different game weights for home and away and for conference and non-conference games. So a lot more math and a lot more. You got to make sure that those are all labeled correctly. Otherwise, you're not going to get the results that you want. And we could definitely see the final Pool C spot decided by thousandth of a decimal point. Just recently, I think spot 21 was tied at 2 decimals. No. It was top 2 teams, NYU and Illinois Wesleyan, were tied at 2 decimal spots, but different at 3 decimal spots. But we could see those sorts of small differences that could be decided by the Liberty League final, because one of those teams played a non-conference game against someone in the ODAC, and that could be the determining factor. I think that's it. I didn't want to go too far past 7, but thanks everyone for tuning in, both those that have and those that will. And Riley and I are always open for questions on social media or email. And we'll put up the data. So we're both on Twitter. There are handles. Riley's got a newsletter that he puts out at least a couple times a week on Division III women's basketball. And then I've got a website that has all sorts of data around the simulations, how teams have done this year, strongest conferences. And that's it. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Go enjoy Tufts Smith, and I have no tagline. So thanks for tuning in.